Florida has arguably never been more of the political moment than it is today, driving the national political agenda and uniquely poised to shape policy in the next administration. Here to help us understand what's happening and how to interpret it, we're joined as we are each month by attorney and local government expert Chris Hand. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning, Ann. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays and thanks for being here. Chris, I first saw this said by our friend, columnist Nate Monroe, saying, America is Florida now. And so, like Florida, there is no personal failing too discrediting, no lie too big, no scandal too repulsive or legally problematic. He is obviously making a connection between the direction of the country and the trail that Florida has blazed in a way in terms of setting a new conversation.
Well, I think it's really remarkable how Florida has become sort of the center of the national political universe. I mean, obviously, look, we have a incoming president of the United States who, calls Florida home. Florida is his legal residence, and perhaps because of that, his orbit has been very Florida centered. And there's really, as you were saying to introduce the show, Ann, there's an unprecedented number of Floridians who are joining a new presidential administration. Look, Florida's the third biggest state in the country, so we've always seen Floridians play roles in presidential administrations, but never before to this extent, where you have multiple cabinet officials or the equivalent of cabinet officials. You have multiple ambassadors from the state of Florida. It really is an unprecedented level of influence that the state of Florida will have in the Trump administration. But I think that's largely derived from the fact that the president elect himself lives in and is from Florida and has built this sort of latest version of his political system here in the Sunshine State.
Well, let's just talk about some of the big players that are from Florida that you think are going to be poised to be influential in this administration that are from Florida. I mean, one that has been spoken about a lot was his essentially Donald Trump's first appointment, Susie Wiles.
Well, that's right. And people here in Northeast Florida are very familiar with Susie Wiles. She served as chief of staff for multiple mayors of Jacksonville. Your guest yesterday, John Payton, Mayor John Delaney, other roles in city government. This has been Susie's home for many, many years. So a variety of people who've worked in government and politics have had working relationships with Susie. So she's very well known here. Of course, she sort of has gone on to have kind of statewide and now national work. She kind of ran the campaign for Rick Scott when he was elected governor of Florida in 2010. She was involved in the DeSantis campaign, probably, decisive in the DeSantis campaign in 2018, again, before joining President Trump's team, both for the last election and more prominently as one of his co-campaign managers for the 2024 election. So, again, uh, this is really the first time that someone from Northeast Florida has occupied that pivotal chief of staff role in the White House. That's a huge role. She has shown herself to be very adept at both managing down and managing up.
Tell us a little bit about the role of chief of staff because that's
Sure.
the role you yourself held. She's going to be the first female chief of staff in this role at this level, but tell us what that job entails.
Well, I think the key part of the job is making sure to advance the principal's priorities. That in a chief of staff role, and each one's different in every level of administration. I served at one in local government, not at the federal government level. But I think the common root to each of those jobs is the responsibility to advance the principal's agenda and their key priorities to make sure that through every aspect of government, whether that's the White House itself, whether that's through the different executive departments, ultimately, whether that's through Congress, the chief of staff's job is to make sure those priorities are moved forward and ultimately become law, helping to build the legacy of the administration. So that's a job that I think Susie's well prepared for, given the work that she's done at sort of different levels of government. I think the key aspect of her potential success in that role is an obviously very close working relationship with President Trump. Look, we watched on election night as he singled Susie out, asked her to come speak. She deferred, said, no, this is kind of your evening. So there's obviously a very close working relationship between her and President Trump. And that's one of the other keys to the job, not just managing down and trying to make sure that other people who report to the president or throughout government advance his priorities, but also trying to manage the principal. And that is something that Susie has skill at, she's got experience with, and obviously has had success in that area with President Trump, as we've seen during his most recent campaign.
Yeah, even though that has serving under the president is sometimes been difficult, as we've seen during his first term, but there are a number of other people from Florida. Who else is on your radar as a Floridian that's of great consequence in this administration?
Well, two of the most high profile cabinet roles, and that's Secretary of State and Attorney General. Obviously, Florida U.S. Senator Marco Rubio has been nominated as the U.S. Secretary of State following service on the Senate Foreign Relations and Senate Intelligence Committee. He was also talked about as a potential candidate for vice president during the summer. His confirmation is expected to be fairly smooth, not much controversy there. But obviously, that's a massive role to represent the United States abroad. He will be serving once confirmed in that. And of course, this didn't happen immediately, but after President Trump's first nominee for Attorney General withdrew, Pam Bondi, who's the former Attorney General of Florida, was nominated as Attorney General. She'll go through the process. It looks like she is likely to be confirmed at this point, although all of this is subject to the congressional hearings that will be held during this process. So right there you have two very probably the two most significant outside of the Department of Defense cabinet roles that are going to be held by Floridians coming up into the next administration, assuming they're confirmed.
Now, Bondi has been a Trump loyalist. Pam Bondi, when she was here, she at forwarded advanced Donald Trump's claims of election fraud. Um, do you what do you see? How does that impact her role as the kind of the chief law enforcement officer in the role of attorney general? Is it concerning that somebody that kind of believed and advanced those false claims is in that seat of power?
Well, that's going to be one of the big questions about the Trump administration in general, and that would be the case whether it was Pam Bondi or somebody else in the office of Attorney General. Traditionally, as you know, there has been a sort of separation between the White House and the Justice Department. The norm has been to treat the Justice Department almost as like an independent authority to make its own decision about cases it may prosecute or other actions it may take. Obviously, President elect Trump has signaled repeatedly that he plans to take a different course, that he wants a situation in his administration where the White House and the Justice Department are more closely linked together. And that sort of traditional independence that you've seen there is not necessarily part of it. I think you can see that in a variety of ways, not just through the appointment of, first Matt Gaetz and now Pam Bondi, people who have been allies of his, for over time, but also at other levels. The new the nominee for deputy U.S. Attorney General was actually Donald Trump's attorney in the New York case where he was prosecuted. So obviously, there's a push toward a more close relationship between the White House and the Justice Department. We don't know exactly what that will look like come January the 20th and beyond, and what the Justice Department will actually do in furtherance of that new close relationship. We'll have to keep an eye on it. There are those who are strong advocates of an independent Justice Department that are concerned that, those lines may begin to become blurred and the traditional deference that the Justice Department has had and the freedom from interference with other parts of government that may go away. Others have suggested that those concerns are overblown. We won't know until we get there, until January 20th. What I will say about Pam Bondi is obviously this is not her first time serving as an attorney general. She was Florida's attorney general from 2011 to 2018, had a number of high profile initiatives, some of which had sort of, widespread agreement, some of which didn't. She came into office very concerned about the effect of opioids on the Florida population. She actually appointed a Democrat, Dave Ehrenberg, who's now the state attorney for Palm Beach County, as kind of her czar in that regard to kind of help tackle that problem, but did other things that were much more controversial, like, filing lawsuits to oppose Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act, obviously, which the Supreme Court ultimately decided was legal. But that generated controversy and, had involvements with the kind of Trump world during her time as Attorney General that was also controversial. So, but she has
In
worked.
terms of not bringing any charges against Trump University,
Correct. That's right.
which
So,
was considered by some to be kind of a scammy operation.
yeah, so there was controversy about that when she was Attorney General, but unlike his first pick, who had not sort of served in a role like this before, I think probably the key to Pam Bondi's likely confirmation in the Senate will be the fact that she has served as in an Attorney General role, elected twice by Floridians, and I think again more likely than not that she's going to be confirmed. But some of these questions will certainly come up during her confirmation hearings, which are scheduled to start in January.
And you note that she was named after it became clear that Matt Gaetz, who was his first choice for AG, wasn't going to make it through that process. But I have seen interviews with some Trump loyalists, including people like Steve Bannon, that said that, Gates should have remained, at least for the duration, as a heat shield to sort of draw attention and, you know, outrage or, concern about his fitness away from other candidates that now are getting more of the spotlight.
Well, I think that withdrawal happened so quickly, largely because members of Congress communicated to the Trump world that that was just an absolute non-starter in terms of that particular role and that feedback and the clear likelihood that he was not going to receive get to the majority votes he needed in the U.S. Senate is why they made a change there. That is going to be an interesting process to watch in general, and because obviously Congressman Gates is no longer involved in that process, but there are other nominees that have proven to be controversial in this process, whether it's the nominee for Secretary of Defense, whether it is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's been nominated to be the Secretary of Health and Human Services, whether it's former Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, who's been appointed the head of the Director of National Intelligence. All of those hearings are going to generate lots of controversy. So we just don't know yet exactly which nominees are going to be approved and which ones aren't. But as you're looking at the full slate, those two very high profile nominees from Florida, Senator Rubio and Pam Bondi, seem likely, as we sit here today, to be confirmed in what is now a Republican Senate.
If you're just joining us, we are talking to local government expert Chris Hand, also a Jacksonville attorney. He joins us each month to talk about the latest state and local political news. You can join our conversation. Give us a call at 904-549-2937. You can also email First Coast Connect at wjct.org, or you can reach out and tag us on social media. So, one of the things that's happening with some of these appointments is what you've described as a domino effect. We're going to be losing some people, including Matt Gaetz, who, quit his role in Congress when he was named and, initially named to be that attorney general. So that seat's vacant. There's a couple of other vacancies. Remind us what's happening there and how that's going to impact state politics.
Well, we're used to seeing the first quarter of a year after an election be one where there's a lot of changeover in government, but not like this, where you not only have the decisions that the voters have made being implemented in government, but where you have a number of officials changing because of these appointments. So, just starting with the U.S. Senate seat, assuming Senator Rubio is confirmed, under Florida law, Governor DeSantis has the ability to appoint a successor to serve until the 2026 election. There'll be a special election then for the final 2 years of Senator Rubio's term, but someone will serve for essentially 2 years in the U.S. Senate. Governor DeSantis will make that appointment. There's been a lot, and he has said, by the way, that he will make that appointment in January, not before the end of the year. There's been a lot of speculation on who that appointment might be. There's been strong support for Laura Trump, who is the daughter in law of the president elect, but a number of Florida names as well. The Lieutenant Governor Jeanette Nunez, the Attorney General Ashley Moody, a former Speaker of the House, Jose Oliva. Those names have all been mentioned as well. President Trump was actually asked about this at his press conference earlier this week and seemed to downplay the idea that Laura Trump might get the appointment and said this is, kind of up to Governor DeSantis to make that decision. That's a big decision for a governor. Not every state gives the governor that sort of appointment power, but Florida does. And so he'll make that appointment in January. That's a big one. And based on that, there could be other dominoes. If he appoints, say, Ashley Moody, the Attorney General, to that role, Governor DeSantis will then appoint an Attorney General to serve through the 2026 election. And in some of the congressional races you talked about, Matt Gaetz obviously resigned from Congress. One of the candidates for that seat is Jimmy Patronis, who's the chief financial officer of Florida, also a member of Florida's cabinet. If he's successful in that election, and the first election is January 28th, with the general election on April the 1st. If he's successful, that will create a vacancy in the office of CFO, which Governor DeSantis will
Wow.
appoint through 2026. So,
Interesting.
and then, of course, because another key Florida appointment, Congressman Mike Waltz, who's been appointed as the National Security
Who
Advisor.
kind of represents parts of St. Augustine and
That's right.
St.
He's
Johns
here.
County.
He's here in the Northeast Florida region. But again, I think going to be serving in the Trump administration. There will be a special election in January and February to succeed him as well. So again, you don't typically see, because all these Florida appointments, one of the consequences is we're seeing a lot of activity, a lot of movement of elected officials in the first quarter of the year, not as a result of decisions of voters made in November, but as a result of decisions that are being made, in terms of appointments.
And so the people who are seeking to fill these seats, there's a number of names that are out there, people who've declared, and this, as you said, could effectively be decided in January. That's kind of the Republican primary, January 28th.
That's right. The election schedule that the Florida Secretary of State has ordered is the party primaries will be on January the 28th, and the, sort of the general election, so to speak, with a Democratic and a Republican nominee will take place on April 1st.
But we know that in Florida, that many times races are decided in the primaries, and very often in the Republicans' favor.
Well, especially in these two seats. These are heavily Republican seats. There's not much mystery about the partisan control of these two seats. I think in the race to fill Congressman Waltz's seat, there are 9 total candidates, 3 Republicans, a number of Democrats, and maybe some other candidates as well. But the winner of that Republican primary, who I think is likely to be State Senator Randy Fine from the Space Coast area, will become the Republican nominee and then certainly the next member of Congress, given the partisan makeup of that district. Same in District 1. District 1 is probably the most Republican congressional
Gates's
district in the
district,
state. That's right. That's Matt Gates' district in
and
the
that's like the Panhandle.
that is the Panhandle, sort of, kind of west of Panama City to the Alabama border, is where that district is located. Again, heavily Republican. There are a bunch of candidates running in that seat. I think there's 10 filed Republican candidates and 1 Democrat running. The favorite is CFO Jimmy Patronis. He's been endorsed by President Trump, likely to emerge from that crowded January 28th primary, win in April, and then take office in Congress, which will create a vacancy in that CFO role.
And so what's interesting for some of these people, including Representative Rudman, who's in that District 1 race,
Mhm.
along with Petronis, is that, they have to resign to run for this seat. And so they're vacating their state House seat. Um, but they're still filing legislation. And there's been some discussion about, what purpose that serves, who they're catering to, who they're trying to please with that legislation. So tell us a little bit about kind of what it means to file a bill and then vacate your seat, and also what it is that they're proposing.
Well, there's a no. I mean, look, that is not surprising that people are using the legislative platforms they have at their disposal to signal to voters in the district what their priorities are. Representative Rudman, as you referred to, I think he's actually resigning effective January 1st. So the bills he's filed, he won't even make it to sort of the first part of session. But he's filed some bills related to sort of access to the beachfront. This was a big issue in Walton County several years ago. There was a big debate between the county and kind of beachfront homeowners about access to the beachfront there. Ultimately, generated a lot of statewide attention. Representative Rudman has filed a bill related to that, trying to show that he wants to make sure that beachfront access is available to everybody. I think clearly designed to sort of send a message, and he so much has said that to voters who are running in that district. And I think he's himself acknowledged that he has an uphill battle in that district because President-elect Trump has endorsed CFO Petronis. But we're also seeing it in the race in District 6 that Representative Waltz is vacating. The likely sort of next member of Congress, leading Republican candidate, Randy Fine, he will only serve in the legislature for a month. In fact, he was just elected to the state Senate in November. He had been in the state House for a number of years, just got elected to the state Senate in November. So he'll only complete about a month of the legislative session before he goes to Washington, but again, has filed a number of pieces of legislation. Now, some of these are consistent with past things he's done in the legislature. He wants to roll back some of the gun safety reforms that were passed in the aftermath of the Parkland shooting in 2018. In terms of, in Florida right now, it's illegal for people under the age of 21 to buy certain firearms. He's proposed to roll that back. He's also filed legislation that would crack down on certain flags, like the Black Lives Matter flag and some others. Again, these are things he talked about when he was in the legislature, but is now, filing legislation to advance that in the Florida legislature for the upcoming session. But of course, he'll only be there for 1 month of it, because if he is elected to Congress on April the 1st, he'll immediately take his seat and will miss the second half of the session. So a lot of this is um, candidates signaling to voters what some of their priorities would be, what issues they care about during the next election session, less so about actually passing legislation, which in the case of Representative Rudman, he'll be there for 0% of session. In the case of Senator Fine, he'll only be there for half of it. So it's less about passing legislation than it is about messaging.
And you talk about the flags, in addition to the Black Lives Matter, it would be banning Palestinian and pride flags. There's been some discussion about whether those bills are signaling to the electorate or really signaling to the incoming administration. Is that a message of some kind to Donald Trump of just kind of loyalty or adherence to a set of principles?
I think the answer is yes. I mean, I think what we've seen from kind of Republican candidates and office holders throughout the country is an effort to sort of be aligned and unified with what they see as, President-elect Trump's vision. So I think a number of those pieces of legislation are not just designed to appeal to a particular portion of the electorate, but also designed to sort of show their alignment with the president's overall goals. I think that's one thing. One question out there has been how will all of these Florida appointments impact policymaking in Washington. And everyone brings their own perspectives, but I think one unique aspect of particularly this latest Trump victory has been the alignment around what the president elect's agenda have been. So you see that in as legislators, congressional leaders talk about what their priorities will be at the beginning of the next Congress in January of 2025, they're very much aligned around his priorities. So that, just earlier this month, incoming Senate Majority Leader John Thune from South Dakota said that the first two major legislative packages they're going to work on, one will be related to sort of the border and energy and defense, and the next one will be related to taxes, probably trying to make permanent the tax cuts of 2017 from when President Trump was in office before. So I think what you're seeing right now, particularly with Republicans' control of both houses of Congress and the White House, is a lot of alignment around his priorities. And as you say, you're also seeing that from people who are running for office right now, trying to make sure that they are seen as adopting those priorities.
If you're just joining us, we are talking to Chris Hand, attorney and local government expert. If you have questions for him or about the state and local politics and headlines of the day, you can give us a call at 904-549-2937. You can email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org, or you can reach out on social media. Um, One of the things that you mentioned was uh, discussions about repealing some of the post-Parkland legislation, including red flag laws, including bills that limited people under 21 from buying rifles and long guns. Because the people that are proposing that legislation are going to be essentially vacating the office that they currently hold, what do you think happens to those bills? Are those serious proposals? Are those things that you think are going to gain traction in the legislature?
Well, they so far have not made it on the list of kind of priorities for the incoming state senate president and state house speaker. So as a result, right now those are bills filed by people who won't be in the legislature. And we've seen again, another sort of bill filed has been to have kind of allow the open carry of weapons in this state.
Which
And
was a big
again,
issue last legislative session as well.
it was, and again, the incoming, Senate president has sort of signaled that, because of opposition from law enforcement, that is not on his priority list. So again, like until any of these bills show up on the priority lists of that incoming House Speaker and the incoming Senate president, it seems less likely that they will actually become legislation. And I think it's important as people, and I know we'll talk more about this when we get together in January, but I think it's important for people as they kind of begin to think about the 2025 legislative session to particularly pay attention to the priorities of the Senate president and the House
I
Speaker.
was going to ask you about
Yeah.
that. I mean, so for people who aren't familiar with that process, just remind us how it is that the bills that are under discussion make it onto that list. Is it just that one person's decision, and how that then proceeds from there?
Well, I think there's probably three key. I mean, look, every member of the state house and state senate, has some involvement here. But I think in terms of setting the agenda, there are probably three key figures. Obviously, the governor's going to propose a budget. He's got legislative priorities as well. But let's also not forget this is the last 2 years of Ron DeSantis' term. So this typically tends to be And when you look at Florida history, a time when a governor has his or her least influence on the process, as people are beginning to think about the 2026 elections to select the next governor. Ron DeSantis is term limited, but he will propose a budget. He'll have legislative priorities. But I think, particularly given the fact that it's the last 2 years of a governor's term, the state Senate president and the state House Speaker gain even greater influence over the process. So I think over the next, couple of months, I would encourage people to watch them. And obviously, this is very important to note always. If there are priorities that each of us as citizens would like to see moved forward in Tallahassee, very important to stay in touch with our members of the legislature, either in the state house and state senate, and communicate that. And now would be a crucial time. They're already beginning to have meetings. They've had organizational sessions. They'll have committee sessions, particularly in the first couple of months of the year. And then, of course, the legislature meets starting in March for a 60-day session.
It is always a little perplexing how much happens in committee before the session gets underway, and I don't know that I even really fully understand why it is that way. I mean, I guess they're trying to shake out what their priorities are, but it does seem to be, a little bit backward because they're, in terms of citizen involvement.
Well, I think that part of it, there's some practical reasons for that, which is it is only a 60-day session. We are unlike some other big states in which they meet for much longer, or even in the case of a couple of them, essentially have permanent legislatures that meet year round. Florida doesn't have that. We have a 60-day session in which to get all legislative business done. In a state that's the third largest in the country, there's a lot of legislative business each year.
And that schedule was sort of a function of the size of the state to begin with, right?
Correct. That's right.
People
Yeah.
having to travel to pass these bills.
Exactly right, and we're in an odd-numbered year, not an election year, so that's why it's March to May. When there is an election year, they tend to meet in January and go through March, obviously because members want to campaign after that. So, that's an important process for people to pay attention to, particularly given that, in recent years, the state budget has been showing surpluses. There's now some contraction in revenue available to government, both at the state level and also the local level. I'm sure we'll talk about more of that in 2025. But as a result, there's probably less funding to go around. So making sure people understand what those priorities are and communicate their priorities to their members of the legislature even more important.
And then when those bills are introduced, typically ones with the lower numbers, the 1, 2s, and 3s, those are seen as the priority bills, the ones that are likeliest to succeed?
Correct. And again, I just think this is where paying close attention to the both the comments and the bills filed by the Senate president, and also seeing who's appointed to key committees. We're going through that process right now, where we're seeing who's appointed to chair various key committees in the Senate and House. That's another piece of data that I think is important in order to kind of analyze an upcoming legislative session. Who's going to be in those key roles? What are they saying about bills that may move or not move?
So, one of the things I wanted to ask you about is the role that all of this is going to have, if any, on the city of Jacksonville. I mean, we've discussed in the past that the current mayor landed in the crosshairs of this administration a little bit with some comments that she made when she was abroad talking about, deportation camps, kind of comparing them to concentration camps. But, uh, what is it that Mayor Deegan can do to make connections in this, broadly Republican-led everything, including federally and at the state level?
Well, I think she's already said, in fact, I think she said it on this show last month in November, that she believes strongly in bipartisanship, that she wants to work with anybody to advance the priorities of Jacksonville. So I think that sort of messaging is exactly the right approach, and actually working to build some of those relationships over time. Look, it's not as if this is unprecedented. There have been achievements in the last couple of years that have involved the mayor and her team working with members of, for example, members of Congress, Congressman John Rutherford and Aaron Bean. That was helpful in securing the funds for the Emerald Trail. So I think trying to actively build those relationships and look for those bipartisan alliances is going to be really important. But I think there's sort of larger issues to be thinking about in how the new administration might relate differently to cities. It's going to be a very different relationship, setting apart any relationship building for a couple of reasons. Obviously, during the Biden administration, there was a large amount of money that came to local governments through what was called the American Rescue Plan. That's now over. That's not going to be repeated. And I think there's going to be less federal money flowing to cities and counties around the country for a variety of reasons, and potentially more cause for debate. One of the early signals the Trump team has sent is that cities that are resistant to their some of their immigration plans, including in terms of deportation of undocumented immigrants, are could well see their federal funds be challenged. So I think important to understand the entire context. But there's still going to be federal grant programs, other things like that that exist. So it really speaks to the importance of building bipartisan relationships at every level, whether that's among members of Congress, whether that's with the state legislature, and like I said, on this show last month, the mayor signaled her intent to do that.
Because in fact, Randy Fine, who's running for that seat that we discussed earlier, that Michael Walz is vacating, threatened to strip funding from Jacksonville altogether at the state level because of those comments, and so, some bridge building to do, I would guess.
Probably so. I mean, he'll be a brand new member of Congress. I think the city's relationship with Congressman Rutherford and Congressman Bean, as well as Senator Scott, and of course there'll be a new U.S. senator from Florida once Marco Rubio is approved and Ron DeSantis appoints a new senator. Building all of those relationships and even working on those that you think aren't gettable, right? I mean, like I think it's always worth a chief executive or others in that situation to make the attempt. It may not be successful. You may disagree on 99 of 100 issues, but I think it's always worth making the attempt to see if you can find common ground because again, that's the role of not just the mayor but members of city council as well to try and advance Jacksonville's priorities by having those sorts of working relationships if possible.
I wanna take a call from Tim in Orange Park. Good morning, Tim. Go ahead.
Good morning. Yes, I was wondering, is there any possible way, legally, I guess, that the incoming president could actually do this term and then get another term? And if the state of New York finds him guilty and says, I don't know, 18 months in jail, in prison, what happens? And thank you so much. I'll take my answer off the line.
Thank you for your questions, Tim. First, on the question of whether President Trump can run again, the answer is no. The Constitution is very clear on that point that a president may serve two terms. It does not say two consecutive terms like it does in the Florida Constitution. The U.S. Constitution is clear the president can serve two terms, period. So President Trump will serve until January 20th, 2029.
There is a historical exception to that, though, with FDR, right? That was a
Right, but that was before the passage of the amendment to the U.S.
okay.
Constitution, which limited presidents to, in fact, probably as a result of Franklin Roosevelt serving or being elected to four terms and serving, three terms and part of a fourth term before he passed away. An amendment was passed to the U.S. Constitution, which limits presidents to two terms. So he's term limited out. There will be a new president on January 20th, 2029, by the plain language of the U.S. Constitution, and President Trump and his team have acknowledged that several times as well. As to the question of New York, of course, he's already been found guilty. That
Right.
occurred over the summer. That he was found guilty of those particular charges. It seems likely at this point that what the judge is going to do, although he hasn't made a definitive ruling on this, is probably defer any sentencing on that case until President Trump is no longer in office.
And that's what the prosecutor in that case has asked for.
Right. So, I mean, like, I think it is unlikely that there are any criminal sanctions imposed on the president because, number one, he is the incoming president of the United States, and there is sort of broad immunity that comes from, in that role. But so I think unlikely there will be any criminal sanction until he leaves office, if then.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like any judge would consider that a good thing for the country if the
Right.
president were to be incarcerated.
Right.
Question from Susan on Facebook. She says, "What's the best way to communicate to our legislators, and do they really care?"
I think the answer is a couple of ways. One, take a look at each of the members of the Florida legislature have a contact page, which tends to show, their names, their contact information at their offices, maybe the names of some of their, team as well. Contact them via email, call them. They also all are present in the community. They often have events where constituents can interact with them. I encourage you to do that and have civil conversations with legislators about what you see as the key priorities. And I think, again, I caution people against just sort of assuming that elected officials don't care. That's a widespread phenomenon and feeling throughout the electorate, and I get that. But again, if you don't make the attempt to communicate and to share your priorities, then you know for a fact they aren't going to take those priorities back to Tallahassee with them because you haven't communicated them. So I really encourage everybody to use their powers of effective citizenship. Communicate with your state senator, your state representative. Make sure they know what you see as the priorities in the state of Florida for 2025 and beyond. And that's part of our effective citizenship responsibility.
Well, Chris Hand, it is always a delight to talk to you. Thank you for your insights and your advocacy for involvement. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Ann.